Hi, this is Paul. Last week I had a conversation I very much enjoyed. I think John enjoyed it too. The member of my local meetup watched it. He told me, he said, "You didn't get all those views on that. You didn't have all those people. I watched the thing 3 times and it was great." So I thought it was a terrific conversation that I had with John Vervaeke. And I introduced an idea that I'd been thinking about, but I really haven't been able to pull off making a video about it. And so this is going to be an attempt to fill in some of the ideas. You know, when I'm talking to John, I don't have everything all put together in my head by any means. I just have some inklings and some ideas, and it's just such a privilege and it's an opportunity I seriously value, to have a conversation partner and a conversation space like that where I can just kind of introduce an idea. And again, hearing a new idea, people don't appreciate how difficult that is. That goes back to that Bell Labs quote where, if you actually have a new idea, don't worry that people will steal it. You'll have to beat people over the head with it before they even begin to have any understanding of it. So just to have a conversation space like that where we can talk and try out some ideas, that's worth more than gold. But right away in the comments of that conversation, there were questions. Well, what is the frame problem? What do you mean by the frame problem? Now, one of the things that I've appreciated as I've continued to do my channel is that when I dove into my channel, I dove into a group of people for whom many of them had watched many hours of Jordan Peterson. And so there was sort of a set body of knowledge that Jordan's fame had created that I could sort of dive into and work my way around, and I could assume a fair amount of information and knowledge. Now, nothing against John's project, but obviously John's videos have a few thousand views each one, 3, 4, maybe 5,000. The first video has like 67,000, which is pretty good, but there's 2, 3, 4,000 people maybe closely following his class, which is a lot of people. But when I got onto Jordan's train, he was at like 300,000 subscribers on YouTube. So there already was a pretty significant mass of people out there that had a lot of familiarity with his language, with his ideas. And so I can't assume that with John's ideas. I can't assume that many, certainly not all, but even many of you have necessarily followed John's videos closely, and even if you've watched them, understood them. Now, I'm not saying anything about you. The truth is that I have to watch John's videos 2 or 3 times sometimes to begin to grasp and appreciate and integrate and understand everything that he's doing. Now, I've enjoyed the whole series, but as John mentioned in the conversation, after videos like 26 to 32, these cover a lot of new material. And in episode 28, I thought he nicely laid out what has come to be known as the frame problem. So I want to watch some of that video with you. Now, I'm also using a different technique. As you notice, I can't zoom in and out because the developers of the Screenomatic.com software that I had been using that would allow me to do that, they continue to have that sound problem, so that I can't really use that software. So I'm using Bandicam software right now, but I'm kind of stuck up here in the edge, but I can do various different takes pretty easily and piece them together, and that sort of works for my schedule, at least if I can be coherent in the same video. But let's watch some of John's this episode with John.
This isn't all that makes you an agent. This is a philosophically complex problem.
Now, again, right away he's talking about agency, and if you're following my channel, you know that a big part of the question beneath the divide between theists and non-theists, between Christians and atheists, is this question of, is there another agent that we can relate to that's, metaphorically speaking, up in the sky? Okay, metaphorically speaking, up in the sky. Although, do we speak in anything other than metaphors? We'll have to think about that. So he's talking about agency here, and we're very quickly going to get into the category problem. And again, watch his videos to figure out this category problem, and then we're going to get into the frame problem with this famous robot illustration. And it's all really, really helpful.
Problem, but the crucial thing about what makes you as an agent is the following. You can determine the consequences of your behavior. I'm using that term very broadly. You can determine the consequences of your behavior and change your behavior accordingly.
Now, if you listen to a lot of Christian rationalists, people debating Sam Harris or other celebrity atheists, this they call rationality. Okay, now there's a nomenclature issue in all of this that is tremendous. And so if you listen to John's videos, you'll notice that he's very careful about what is rationality. What is this? Well, what he just described there, Sam Harris would probably call rationality. And it's not a bad definition of rationality, but it's all bundled up with this agency, that a rational agent is one who sort of has an image, has a picture of the arena that they are the agent within, and they are able to forecast and predict a little bit. Such action will produce such outcome, and so I can adjust my actions to produce this other outcome. We very much call that a rational agent.
And the consequences of your behavior, I'm using that term very broadly, you can determine the consequences of your behavior and change your behavior accordingly. So this ability to determine the consequences, the effects of your behavior, is crucial to being an agent. So we build a machine that can do that. It can determine the consequences of its behavior. Now we give it this problem, very basic problem. Right? So here's a wagon, right?
Okay, now I realize that I didn't update my link, so I'm going to go back a number of minutes, but you can see right there we've got the robot illustration that we're going to go to. But before we get there, we want to understand some of the background for what sets up this illustration.
Logical to a psychological account of similarity.
Okay, we're going to talk about similarity because similarity gets you into the category problem. Well, what's the category problem? We make categories all the time in our mind. We, in fact, create categories so automatically, so intuitively, so subconsciously that we don't even think about it. But this categorization is actually a huge deal. And again, I hate to say watch all of his videos to understand this, but this category issue is really a big issue in terms of how we deal with the world. And this category issue was actually behind a lot of the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris conversation that they were trying to have. Jordan kept trying to tell Sam, there's a lot more going on here. And Sam just sort of kept wanting to kick up his normal village atheist puzzles that he likes to throw out.
In what matters, right?
And again, matters. I mean, Peterson will use this word a lot. Matter is relevance, all right? Relevance is a huge, huge term here that we're going to deal with a lot in this video.
For psychological similarity is not any true comparison, but finding the relevant comparisons. And the thing about that is that doesn't seem to be stable. Barzalou pointed this out. So I'm going to give you a set of things. Is it a category? Okay, so it's your wife, pets, works of art, gasoline, explosive material. Is that a category?
Okay, so this is an illustration. Now, as you listen to him, I want you in the back of your mind to think about what he will use to create the category. Okay? I'll give you a hint. It's going to be a narrative. Because narrative creates category and relevance by virtue of the thing that narrative is. And again, if you look at the Peterson-Harris talks, you'll notice how many times they come back to narrative. And Sam Harris keeps wanting to, in some way, say, well, narratives are lovely illustrations, but narratives don't really control. That is such a naive perspective on how people actually live. Okay, back to the illustration.
Gasoline, pets, works of art, wife, pets, works of art, gasoline, explosive material. Is that a category? Works of art, your children, your spouse, gasoline, explosive material. Is that a category? You go, no, they don't share enough in common. Now here's what I say to you. There's a fire. Oh, wait, all those things belong together now. Because I care about my wife, I care about my kids, and fire can kill them, pets, and explosive stuff and flammable stuff is dangerous.
Now, once he said, there's a fire, one of the shortest sentences you can imagine, and again, watch Mary's video about subjects and predicates and propositional truth and hands, and this terrific video that Mary made. There's a fire. Suddenly, your mind leapt forward, and you could understand the categorical frame by which all those seemingly disparate elements could, in fact, have a relevant connection between them, where, in fact, action might leap out into, in fact, that's all he did. He just gave us certain elements and said, think about a category. And then he said, there's a fire, and whoosh, story immediately leapt into your head, and it all lit up. Now, that's powerful, and it's so automatic, and it's so prevalent that we simply live within it.
Now it forms a category. In one context, not a category, and in another context, a very tight and important category. Now, the logical sharing has not changed. What's shared psychologically is what properties or features you consider relevant for making the comparison. Out of all of what is logically shared, you zero in, you see, on the relevant features for comparison. You do the same thing when you're deciding that two things are different.
You can go back to Sesame Street. One of these things is not like the other. What children are working on is this machinery that captures relevance and categorizes things. And now it's really important here, another dimension, in a communal way. Okay? So communities see categories together, and there are established categories within communities. Now, far later, when we get back to Jordan Peterson and Carl Jung, see when we talk about archetypes, and well, where do these archetypes reside? Well, that's a very, very difficult question. We can at least say that these archetypes reside in communities, and maybe even further than communities, and they're maybe even built into us more deeply than just, let's say, the culture level that Brett Weinstein talks to. But these categories reside in communities, and as Brett Weinstein said, this culture layer that we develop, you're not human without that culture layer in many respects. Now, don't jump on me in terms of abortion or things like that. I'm trying to make a point here that can't simply be dragged out to every thing of interest to you, which illustrates again what is actually happening here and how we do this so automatically and how, in fact, our lives depend on it.
Because any two objects, any objects you think are really the same, also have an indefinitely large number of differences. And when you are holding things as different, it's because you've zeroed in here, shape and use are relevant.
He's looking at an eraser and a marker, okay, on this little table in front of the whiteboard, for those of you who are listening and not watching.
Differences. So, at the core of your ability to form and use categories is your capacity, again, for zeroing in on relevant information. Now, one thing that people sometimes say to me when I start talking this way is they say, Darwin. And we'll talk about Darwin again, right? And Darwin's very important, and we'll talk about his work. But what they mean by that is, like, you're doing all this abstract, concrete survival situations, right? I just got to make a machine that can survive, right? And that's just obvious, right? It avoids this and it finds that.
So, again, in some ways, if you go back to Transliminal 2015, Jordan talking about, Jordan's pragmatic truth. See, Jordan is also dealing with the frame issue, which is what John is dealing with right here. Because one thing is like the other or not like the other, that depends on what we imagine to be the frame. Now, the frame is a third thing that's introduced into our consciousness, not as a thing within our consciousness, but sort of a filter which our consciousness is using to superimpose upon these two things. And he might have the dry erase marker and the dry erase eraser and say, how are these two things alike? Well, they both pertain to a dry erase board, and they're both graspable with my hands, and there's all kinds of ways in which they're together. Well, which ways are they not alike? Well, one is cylindrical and round, and the other is square and soft. And we use them, in fact, to do opposing things. All right? So this is the frame problem. And so the way Jordan Peterson uses Darwin is, in a sense, to say, okay, survivability is the frame through which we can know truth, because that then becomes the standard by which we can judge things. But that isn't anywhere near as simple as it sounds either, because we have to ask the question, what will survive? And again, if you jump all the way to a book that I have mentioned many, many times, and will again in this video, a book that Jordan recommends, which is The Metaphysical Club, it isn't actually Finch which survives. It's not an individual finch. It's not even finchness, because finchness is variable. And that's how John's work here connects with Darwin and this question of relevance. And John's really continue to work through this thing, this relevance realization. And okay, this is so good, but what exactly are we talking about? And I is it a black box? And, I didn't quite understand all of the ramifications of that term, but is it God? Is it this, what is it? Well, we don't know, but it's certainly built into us and built into, well, when it's us looking at the world and imagining it, I mean, it's so crucial. So,
well, first of all, is it? We've got to make a machine that can survive, right? And that's just obvious, right? It avoids this and it finds that. Well, first of all, is it? So one of the things a machine has to do, for example, is avoid danger. Danger, Will Robinson, right? Danger. What set of features do all dangerous things share? Don't tell me synonyms for danger. I mean, holes are dangerous. Bees are dangerous. Poison is dangerous. Knives are dangerous. Lack of food is dangerous. What do all of those share? And don't say, well, they lead to the damaging of your tissue. That's what danger, those are synonyms for danger. Of all, what I'm talking about are causes of danger. What do they share? How do you zero in on them? You still...
And again, so often in science, we presume this monarchical vision, which is tremendously handy. This view from nowhere, where we abstract ourselves and we forget the viewer. All right? And we shouldn't forget the viewer in this. And that should become a habit that we begin to cultivate if we actually want to integrate the viewer into the picture. But that integration is so thoroughly problematic, which is the reason why we've excluded it by creating this fictional monarchical vision by which we imagine we can sort of see the world without filters and eliminate the frame problem. And again, you might be getting intuitions about why I connect God with this frame problem and its solution.
People say, well, I sort of get that, but still, just moving around the world, finding your food. Okay, well, let's do that. Let's try and make a machine that's going to deal with that very basic problem. It's going to be a cognitive agent looking for its food. Now, because it's an electronic machine, it's a robot, we're going to have it look for batteries. This is an example from Daniel Dennett. So here's my robot. It's mobile. It's got wheels. It's got this appendage for grabbing stuff. It's got all these wonderful sensors. It's got lots of computational power. Okay. So we know what we need to do in order to make it an agent, a cognitive agent. That's what we've been talking about from the very beginning. It has to be different from merely something that generates behavior. Everything generates behavior. This behaves in a certain way, this behaves in a certain way.
He's pounding on his dry erase board and his marker and the cabinet.
This behaves in a certain way. What makes you an agent, I mean, this isn't all that makes you an agent. This is a philosophically complex problem. But a crucial thing about what makes you as an agent is the following. You can determine the consequences of your behavior. I'm using that term very broadly. You can determine the consequences of your behavior and change your behavior accordingly. So this ability to determine the consequences.
Okay, and this is again a rational agent, as I said when I first started this video.
The effects of your behavior is crucial to being an agent. So we build a machine that can do that. It can determine the consequences of its behavior. Now we give it this problem, very basic problem. So here's a wagon, right? It has a nice handle, and on it is a nice juicy battery. And the robot, right, will try and do what you and I do, right? And this is also a Darwinian thing, because for most creatures, you have to not only find food, you have to avoid being food. And so you don't just eat your food where you first find it. Even powerful predators like leopards move their food to another location because it will get stolen, they could get preyed upon, etc. You don't eat your food where you first come across it. Fast food restaurants are a somewhat of an anomaly, but like when you walk into the supermarket, you just don't start eating. You try and take your food to a more safe place. You try and share your food with other people because that's a socially valuable thing to do. That's why when you're eating something you don't like, you give it, ooh, this tastes horrible, taste it. You want to share, right? You want to use food as a way of sharing experience, bonding together. So the robot is programmed to take its food, the battery, to a safe place and then consume it. Well, that seems just so simple, right? That's so simple. Well, we have to make this a problem because we're talking about being a problem solver.
And again, if you look at the previous video, he talked about what a problem is, and that's really helpful in terms of constraint. And there's so much good stuff. Again, a note to Christians, and I know Christians, well, John's not a Christian, so I'm not going to listen to him. Oh, okay. Well, do you listen? Is your doctor a Christian? Is the guy who fixes your furnace a Christian? There's tons of good stuff, whether or not, to the degree to which you agree or disagree with a bunch of John's framing here. What he's walks through is a ton of really helpful stuff within his class, and so that's why I think these lectures are really helpful.
And on this wagon is a lit bomb. The bomb is lit, which means there's a very high probability
that's a lit bomb, not lip balm.
Fuse will burn down and the bomb will go off. And we put the robot in this situation. And what does the robot do? The robot pulls the handle because it has determined that a consequence, an effect of pulling the handle is to bring the battery along. So it pulls the wagon and it brings the battery along because that's the intended effect, right? That's the consequence that it is determined is relevant to its goal, okay? But of course the bomb goes off and destroys the robot and we think, oh, what did we do wrong? What did we do wrong? There's something missing. And then we realize, you know what? We made the robot only look for the intended effects of its behavior. We didn't have the robot check side effects.
Now, intention is a huge deal here in this conversation because, again, the divide between a theistic conception of evolution and an atheistic conception of evolution is exactly this question of intent. All right, you look at the conversations, and so there's a group of people with let's call it a product out there that they call intelligent design. Now that's a branding of a certain position that I'm neither going to endorse or not endorse because frankly I don't know enough about it. But I just want to again point out that as the Metaphysical Club clearly states, that what happens with Darwin is this transition when many people begin to believe that there's a mechanism in the world that can lead to the outcomes that we are clearly experiencing today without intent. And intent is a really difficult thing to know, even when we're looking at other people and the actions that they're doing. So often we presume intent when the person on the inside might say, I did not intend that. So even if we get into this conversation about what exactly is intention, it's a hugely important and complex thing. And so right now with this robot and his desire to bring this battery to a safe place and consume it and charge himself, intention is very much involved and active in this little story.
Of its behavior, we didn't have the robot check side effects. And that's really important, right? Every year this happens. People fail to check side effects. They go into a situation in which they know flammable gas is diffuse, but it's dark. And so they strike a match because they want the intended effect of making light.
What I love about that story is it's so untrue today. That story, now pay attention, because this actually has everything to do with these narratives and worlds that we inhabit. You strike a match in order to see in a dark place where gas might be diffuse. When did that happen? When people carried matches. When did people carry matches? When they smoked. Today, a millennial goes into a dark room, little smell of gas. What are they going to pull out in order to see? Do they have a match on them? Probably not. You know what they're going to pull out? Their smartphone with a camera, and it's probably not going to trigger the gas. But here, even in this little story, if I know something about the transition in history, that shines light even onto this little illustration, and we can begin to see these frames and how it's not just the person in the gas and me thinking about the person in the gas. There are innumerable other elements to this story that lurk outside of our awareness or consciousness, and then insight pulls something into the story, and the entire story changes, and in fact we learn a third thing.
But it has the unintended effect of creating heat, which sets off the gas and explodes and harms or kills them. So, we say.
And then there's the Canadian filter, because when I went to college back in the 80s, the group of people who smoked the most at Calvin College, Canadians.
We have to have the machine not only check the intended effects, it has to check the side effects of its own behavior. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to give it more computational power, right? It's going to right, more sensors, way more computational, and we're also going to put a black box inside this, like they do in an airplane, so that we can see what's going on inside the robot. And then we're going to put it into this situation, because this is
Now that's a different use of black box, okay? A little more relevance, realization, and detection going on here.
Great test situation. Because once we solve this simple Darwinian problem, we'll have a basically intelligent machine. So we put it in this situation. And it comes up to the wagon, and then and nothing happens. It doesn't do anything. And we go, what? The bomb goes off, right? Why didn't it just move away from the wagon, or why didn't it try to lift the battery off? Well, we take a look and we find that the robot is doing what we programmed it to. It's trying to determine all of the possible side effects. So it's determining that if it pulls the handle, that will make a squeaking noise. If it pulls the handle, the front right wheel, right, the front left wheel will go through 30 degrees of arc. The front right wheel will go through 30 degrees of arc. The back wheel, same way. Back left wheel, back right.
And if you haven't listened to everything, what he's going through is this combinatorial explosion, that there are so many factors in the robot pulling the wagon that if he were to stop and compute all of these in the moment, he couldn't do anything.
There'll be a slight wobbling and shifting in the wagon. The grass underneath the wheels is
because these are all side effects.
going to be indented. The position of the wagon with respect to Mars is being altered. Do you see what the issue is here? The number of side effects is combinatorially explosive. Oh, crap. So what do we do? Right. Well, we think we'll give, and this is something I'm going to argue later we can't do. We come up with a recipe, a definition of relevance. Nobody knows what that is. I'm going to, in fact, argue later that that's actually impossible, and that's going to be crucial for understanding our response to the meaning crisis. But let's give the possibility. We have a definition of relevance, and what we'll do is we'll have the robot, right, determine, right, which side effects are relevant or not. Oh, so that's great. So we add that new ability here. We give it some extra computational power. We put it in here, and
he's putting his relevance black box into the robot.
It goes up to the bomb and the wagon, and the battery, and the bomb goes off, and it just sits there calculating. And what's going on? And we notice, we look inside, and it's making two lists. And it's, here's the wheel turning, that's irrelevant, and it's judging that is irrelevant. Oh, here's the change in it's irrelevant. And it's making a list, and this list is going, and it's correctly labeling each one of these as irrelevant. But the list keeps going and going and going. See, this is going to sound like a Zen koan. You have to ignore the information, not even check it. See, relevance realization isn't the application of a definition. It is somehow intelligently ignoring all the irrelevance and somehow zeroing in, making the relevant stuff salient, standing out, so that the actions that you should do are relevant to you, are obvious to you.
Now, if you jump back to the Jordan Peterson, Matt Dillahunty conversation, this was in many ways the conversation that Peterson and Dillahunty were having. And Peterson was making Vervaeke's point that you cannot have a list of rules to guide you, because there'd be way too many rules. You can't work this way. And the reason we know it can't work this way is because we've tried it with robots. We didn't realize this about ourselves. And this is, so you listen to Jordan Peterson and Matt Dillahunty argue this point back and forth. Well, Dillahunty's wrong. He's just wrong. And Vervaeke's just illustrated why Dillahunty's wrong. And both Vervaeke and Peterson see this because they're both looking at these problems that psychologists, robotics engineers, philosophers have discovered now in the process of us trying to duplicate and empower a machine with even the minimal abilities that we have.
This is the problem of the proliferation of side effects in behavior, in action. This is called the frame problem. Now, there's
Did you hear it? It's right there.
different aspects. This is the problem of the proliferation of side effects in behavior, in action. This is called the frame problem. Now, there's different aspects of the frame problem. One was a technical aspect, a logical aspect in computational programming, and Shanahan, I think, is correct that he and others have solved that technical problem. But what Shanahan himself argues is once you solve that technical version of the frame problem, this deeper problem remains. And of course, he calls this deeper problem, this deeper version of the frame problem, the relevance problem. he happens to think that consciousness might be the way in which we deal with this problem. We'll talk about that later. Many people are converging on the idea that consciousness and related ideas like working memory have to do with our ability to zero in on relevant information. But let's keep going. Because what about communication?
Okay, let's not keep going. Let's jump to something else. Because here, well, there's the frame problem or the relevance problem. Now, it isn't just John Vervaeke that's dealing with this. Here's a if you just go to YouTube. Now, again, here's where Google begins to take into account subjectivity, because when I'm in YouTube, signed in under my account, and I do a Google search, Google tries to find, this is so freaking brilliant and a little bit scary. Google tries to find a video that is relevant to me based on all of my other searches and choices and likes and views and everything. Google is wrestling with the frame problem in its algorithms, and Google's success in that is what makes YouTube so powerful. So I go to YouTube, I type in the frame problem into YouTube, and this is the first video that comes up with. Wow. So let's listen to it. This is Hubert Dreyfus, who teaches philosophy at Berkeley, and you can find him in a number of videos online talking about philosophy. He's very good at what he does.
At the end of the time I was at MIT, there was a graduate student named Charniak, who was trying to make a program that would have common sense, and it was supposed to have at least the intelligence of a 4-year-old child. And to see whether it had the intelligence of a 4-year-old child, it was supposed to be able to answer questions of the sort that a 4-year-old child could answer after hearing a simple story. So,
now notice again the role of narrative in this, hearing a simple story. And notice how smart this child is and where this knowledge comes from.
and this is how the problem was presented and how it emerged. They were going to use Minsky's ideas of frames, and Minsky had suggested that there was something there. For instance, the birthday party frame tells you that in birthday...
Okay, now the birthday party frame. Now, even within this frame, there are nested narratives and so much information that you know that you're not even conscious of knowing, because if all that flooded into your consciousness, you wouldn't have room to work. That's how powerful we are. It's crazy, crazy scary.
The children have parties and they bring presents and so forth, and we know that as a kind of list of things, and you could give the computer a birthday party frame. This is what Lynette does for millions of frames. So the idea was, you tell the computer the following story. Mary and it was Jack's birthday. Mary and Jane were going to Jack's. Let's take him a kite, said Mary. No, said Jane, he's already got one. He'll make you take it back. Now, what's interesting about that is that if you ask a child, why were they going to Jack's, the child will know it's to a birthday party, though it's never said in there. It just says it was his birthday and they were going to Jack's. Now,
notice the videographer closing the frame as he talks about the frame.
That's the frame will fill that in. And if you ask the child, and why were they bringing him a kite, the child will know it's a birthday present, although it doesn't say anything about birthday presents. The frame will fill it in. But then comes the tough one. It ends by saying, no, he's already got one. He's already got a kite. He'll make you take it back. Now, if you ask the question, what does the it refer to? Does it refer to the kite he's already got, or the kite, or the new kite that he'll have to take back? The grammar was set up so you couldn't just look back and find out. It says he's already got one, that is the old kite. He'll make you take it back. Grammatically, he ought to make them take the old kite back. But every child, presumably even by the time they're 4, knows that if you've got two things like that, and you get a new, and if you got one and you get another one, you have to take the new one back. You can't take the old one back to the store. Now, the question is, where is that bit of knowledge put?
Where is that knowledge? How does this child know this?
It's not in the birthday party frame. Well, there are two things, according to this Charniak thesis. One, the rule, if you've already got one thing, you don't want another one just like it. It's hard to know where to put a rule like that. Secondly, you have to take the new one back. You can't take the old one back. That was their upset. Because where in the organization of knowledge are you going to put that? In the department store frame, in the birthday present frame, in the middle-sized dry goods frame? It doesn't make any, it's just a piece of knowledge we know. And there's millions of pieces of knowledge, presumably, like that we know.
And so here's this piece of knowledge, and that knowledge is also culturally contextual, where there's this entire consumer society, and there's this tradition of buying and selling, and stores, and newness and oldness, and categories, and that's all built into this. And the 4-year-old can manage this.
Which wouldn't be organizable into frames, and we wouldn't know what to do with them. And if you put them on just one great big list, then the relevance problem appears again, even worse. So, and they've never solved it. They don't know how to organize knowledge so that knowledge like that is going to be in the right place. But I thought when I heard it, that's just the beginning of the problem. Take the rule, if you've already got one, you don't want another just like it. That certainly, or might apply to...
Okay, just like it. Go back to Vervaeke's thing. Two things. These two things are not like the other. Well, how are they not like the other? Well, they're both kites, and I like kites, and I fly them, and well, maybe I want one type of kite for one kind of sailing, and another type of kite for another kite, one that I take to the park and one that I take to the beach, or one that's red and one that's yellow, because I like to have my kite match my outfit when I take my kite out for a lovely day of flying my kite. Again, Dreyfus is exactly right, as is Vervaeke, that this is just the beginning of the problem.
Kites, I'm not even sure, but it certainly doesn't apply to dollar bills or marbles or cookies. If the rule really says everything else being equal, if you've got one, you don't want another one just like it. But this everything else being equal has packed in it the whole knowledge of the human condition in the rules. I mean, you have to know whether, for instance, cookies, if you've got one cookie, you might want another. But if the cookie is huge, maybe one is enough. But then again, if you're a cookie monster, one, it wouldn't be enough. And
or a cookie addict.
A whole background understanding of human coping. This kid at 4 already has, and has it in a way which is very hard to understand how it's organized, and can't be captured in strict rules, but only what's called ceteris paribus rules, which are these everything else being equal.
Again, back to Jordan Peterson talking to Matt Dillahunty. Dillahunty, the people that say, well, we can develop these rules to govern this. No, you haven't looked anywhere near as deeply into this problem, even in common narratives.
Rules. And then the common sense knowledge problem reappears in the everything else being equal. And it was clear to me at that point that they're never going to make it, that common sense knowledge just isn't going to be graspable in the form of knowing a lot of facts, that it's got to be organized in some entirely different way.
And this is exactly when it will go way back to when I was doing videos about Matt Dillahunty and Sam Harris and their talks with Jordan Peterson. And facts are all these bricks. Okay, they're all these bricks, or all these Amazon boxes. And we're going to manage the world, this world of object, and the world is full of facts. And here's the thing. Combinatorial explosion makes that world impossible, because there's an infinite number of boxes, and all the ways that it's only this sort of illusion, this cultural illusion that you have. It's a heuristic. It simplifies it down, and you've simplified it to certain boxes, and you're just like, okay, here, 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 here. Well, there we have it. But you haven't looked anywhere nearly deeply enough. Well, how do we know this? Because we tried creating thinking machines, and we keep trying to, and we realize, oh my goodness, This is so hard. This 4-year-old knows so much. And things matter. We haven't even talked about desire yet.
And then I think now people are beginning to understand that it'll have to be organized in kind of skill and pattern recognition ways that don't use the computer as philosophers would have used the computer, namely as having in it symbols and rules, but use the computer to simulate the brain, because the brain obviously does it. The brain learns to match whole millions of input patterns with appropriate actions. And when we understand that, we'll understand something about intelligence. There'll still be a huge gap, by the way. I'm not absolutely optimistic about even the neural networks, because they have to take the input that they get and, how will we put it? I don't want to, they aren't human, so you can't use mental terms, but let's use mental terms. They have to take a given input and see it as similar to input that they've already got in order to process it, or take it as input. They have to process it, here's the way to say it, as similar to some previous input. Because if they've learned that input like this, I could draw something on the board of zeros and ones, is paired with this action, and then they get an input which has similar bunch of zeros and ones, but not quite the same, they have to see it as similar to the appropriate previous input.
See, there's that similarity problem. It's exactly what Vervaeke is talking about. And, well, you have to pause, see it. Well, where's this category coming from? Am I imposing this category upon it? Am I deriving this category from it? What are the frames that are relevant to the categorization process? Now, I'm a motivated agent. And my motivations within my agents are very much being filled into the categories that I'm looking at in order to do this. Now, I'm out of time right now. I have to do a conversation, and so I hope when I pick up this video again after my conversation, the conversation hasn't so lost me that it'll probably warp me in some different ways, but I'll have to pause right now. It won't seem like a pause to you, but it's a pause to me, and I'm going to come back to another video with Hubert Dreyfus and we're going to see just how deep this thing goes and just how many steps we always jump as communities in order to talk about things like justice. So we see is that this frame problem is really a very big deal, and we're quite unconscious of the frame problem because we live so dynamically, so effortlessly within all of these frames, switching these frames very easily. And we only begin to notice what we're doing when we have to try to develop what we so normally effortlessly do when we're trying to develop a robot or a thinking machine of some sort. Now, Dreyfus goes on, I think it's the same interview because the setting is all the same, and I don't know the source video for both of these videos, but he goes on and he talks about Socrates and some of the ways that some of the things that Socrates teaches us what we don't know.
Socrates was a kind of intellectualist or rationalist, and he thought that for anybody to be an expert in any domain, they had to understand the principles on which they were acting in that domain.
Now, what we're going to see is that what we imagine is that we understand the principles. What do we mean by that? That we can somehow reproduce things according to our expectations and assumptions of them.
Otherwise, he said, they were just like cooks. They had a knack based on kind of empirical feedback. They just knew what pleased people, but that wasn't what you should have. If you understood the domain, you would have a theoretical account. You could make the point like this, that Socrates thought that cooks knew from experience what tasted good, but doctors had a theory about what was good for you. And he already, Plato or Socrates, Plato more, had this tremendous admiration for doctors because they were they thought at the time, the first people who had a worked out theory of health and could deduce what was good for you.
few of us would care to be under the care of a doctor from Plato's era at this point, but we'll continue.
So Socrates went around asking experts in various domains to tell him the rules by which on which they acted. And for instance, in the Euthyphro, which is one of the very early dialogues where Plato is telling us what Socrates did, Socrates runs into a prophet named Euthyphro who supposedly knows what pious behavior is. And Socrates says to Euthyphro, I want you to tell me the, I don't know if he says rule or principle, something like that, by which you can tell which actions are pious. Because
now, rule and principle are not really the same thing. Principle, again, is sort of from on top, and the principle, in a sense, is the thing that's on top of the hierarchy which permeates down. It's sort of something analogous to this monarchical vision where everything is clear from the view from above. So, in other words, if you understand the principle behind pious behavior, you can fully explain and explicate what pious behavior is, which our assumption would be that in any given situation, you would know what the pious should do and you could do it.
Euthyphro is turning in his father for killing a slave, which is a very sort of vexed situation, since on the one hand you're not supposed to kill people, on the other hand you're not supposed to turn in your father. So, but Euthyphro claims that he knows exactly which is right, and Socrates wants to know the principle by which he knows that it's right to turn in his father. And what Euthyphro does, however, is give Socrates a bunch of examples of things that the gods have done and famous people have done that everybody agrees are pious. And Socrates, and this is the first important move in philosophy, I believe, says, I don't want your examples. I want the rule that enables you to pick out those as examples of piety.
Now we already see by the use of examples, we already see Aristotle knocking at the door. This is a far longer video that I'm going to play, but we'll go on.
A very clever move. But unfortunately, Euthyphro can't give him any rule. Although Euthyphro claims to be able to recognize piety when he sees it, he doesn't have a piety recognizing principle, or at least he can't find it and Socrates can't get it out of him, and the dialogue ends like all these Socratic dialogues in a kind of failure to find the rule by way of the piety recognition rule. And Socrates concludes then that Euthyphro doesn't really know what piety is. Therefore, he can't really be an expert or a prophet. And then Socrates discovers that people don't know what justice is either. Statesmen don't know what justice is.
Read Plato's Republic.
Because they can't give a definition of justice. And this is very upsetting to Socrates. And it turns out nobody in the whole that he finds and questions can give the rules by which they operate in their capacity as experts. So Socrates reaches this famous conclusion that nobody knows anything, and he doesn't know anything either. He doesn't have any rules that he operates on. So that it looks like Western philosophy begins and ends right there, a very unfortunate conclusion that, in effect, nobody knows anything. Socrates knows one thing more than anybody else, namely that neither he nor anybody else knows anything. And that's because they've got this theoretical notion of what counts as expertise or knowledge, practical knowledge. And they think there must be a theory behind it, and he can't find the theory.
Now this gets into the frame problem. Now the video obviously goes on, and I've only spent 4 minutes of almost a 2-hour video, and I haven't watched the whole thing. But this very quickly gets us into this frame problem that we imagine that, if we go back to Vervaeke's point, we imagine that somehow we can create this description of relevance or this essence of relevance, and we can't do it because when it comes to justice, we have to manage the different things. And when it comes to piety or proper behavior beneath the gods, we have to manage different things. And we struggle very much to try to come up with a rule. So what we see here is that there's this massive relevance realization that is necessary to operate even with the normal kinds of issues that are involved in our everyday life. We practice justice, even though to define justice is very difficult. We attempt to do what is right or do what is pious, even though the rule of piety we struggle with. Now, someone might say, very rightly, well, you're a Christian. Our rule is love. Good. In any given situation, even when you have the rule to figure out what is actually whether a particular action is in keeping with the rule, that then becomes difficult. Now you distribute this over an enormous social systems, enormously scalable down to every single human relation, and it's a wonder that we can do anything at all. And in some ways it sort of mirrors the same problem that we have with knowledge, that even with this tiny little story about the birthday party, very quickly it expands out, and yet the 4-year-old has a knowledge of how to deal with it. Maybe not a perfect knowledge, but a knowledge that's good enough. Now, how did we get all of this, and how did this all come to be? Now, the ancients would have said God or the gods, creatures that had relevance, beings with relevance realization, bestowed this upon us. Prometheus brought the fire, let's say. Agents with intentionality, agents with reason, gave us limited capacity for reason. If you read C.S. Lewis's Miracles, you can actually see this at play in C.S. Lewis's configuration of it, because reason in C.S. Lewis's conception within Miracles is sort of the ability to step away from this great chain of causality, this huge chain of billiard ball-like causal relationships that make up the whole show and this closed system, where reason or rational agents, as John Vervaeke described it, where we can, in a sense, stand apart from the situation, imagine ourselves into the situation and say, now if I do this, there will likely be this outcome, but if I do this, there will likely be that outcome. I would prefer, for reasons that are nearly equally mysterious to me, I would prefer outcome B to outcome A, so I will choose action B in order to pursue outcome B and to get there. Now, that was the dominant answer to this source of this tremendous capacity that we as human beings possess, which far outstrips that of the animals or anything else that we've yet to encounter in this world. Now, what happens with Darwin is that a new story comes into being that, in a sense, begins to trouble this capacity of reason that we have. We could call it relevance realization, which would be another framework, another framing of this capacity. And so now the story goes that basically post-Darwin, 16 billion year chain of purposeless, unintentional, non-rational interactions until some creatures achieve intentionality, rationality, actually become these agents, and in fact are vested with all kinds of knowledge that we don't really have right now in our consciousness. Now, because of this, we no longer need this conscious being that has bestowed upon us this capacity that the conscious being has, of which we have a lesser part, a more fragile, compromised, limited aspect. Now, instead, this is an emergent property which somehow has simply developed completely unintentionally, and we have to either our joy or our sorrow. Now, one of the questions I perpetually consider when I look at this story of how we came to possess this capacity that now we see in far greater light because of the frame problem or the relevance problem is why did we give up on God? Now, a lot of people will say, well, we simply had to. And for me, who hasn't, I think, well, why did you have to and I didn't have to? Well, you should. Well, why should I? What in all of sociology or all of the creation is binding me to give up on the idea that this capacity, which I clearly possess, which is dramatically present in human beings and dramatically absent in nearly, at least to the degree that we have it, in nearly the rest of the world as we know it, well, this God was so simple and useful, and not just for this. As we go along, this God seems to be useful for just about everything. What an amazing explanatory tool. Now, the reason it's, well, so on one hand, it's God is an amazing explanatory tool. On the other hand, there are problems, and we should face those problems. Does it make us lazy in the search for knowledge and solutions? Well, that's certainly true for many people, but then one would have to answer the question of why was it that science and this practice of rationality, this use of science, which is the attempt to explain things that go on their own, why it was Christian people that sort of got this thing started. And in fact, Christian ministers and Christian people got this thing started out of the desire to know God better. And so we would have to say this belief in a God does not necessarily make us lazy. It could be that people are lazy for whole sorts of reasons, and it gets expressed both ways with respect to this. Well, I think another reason is that God is an existential threat that gets involved now in politics. That's Richard Dawkins' complaint in his appearance on the Unbelievable podcast, and in religion always. Remember, politics now, religion is the always. God is this existential threat because if in fact we who possess this limited capacity of rationality or relevance realization, if there is in fact someone else writing scripts far above our power and capacity, this is a tremendous threat and seen as such. And we might in fact compliment the ancients for having the moral courage to live with this threat. Now, one of the things that the story in Genesis 3 does is establish, in a sense, a distance between ourselves and the threat. The man and the woman are exiled from the garden, and they are kept out of the garden, away from the tree of life where they would eat it and live forever. And they are distanced from the God, okay? And there seems to be a degree of mercy in that distance. And without too much thinking about it, you can very much understand it. And I think, in fact, that degree of mercy in that distance is expressed in this large pushing away of the God that we have seen in secularity. God is by definition someone we can't control and who might have designs on us that violate our sense of our rights or our freedom, as if we could have this idea merely from nature, because if we simply look at nature, humans seem to have no more rights than the goat tied to the post there to feed the tiger. The tiger recognizes no human rights, just as the tiger recognizes no goat rights. And so this entire idea of rights is tremendously difficult to get to apart from, let's say, a human being speciesist preference for ourselves over others, or maybe other human beings to the degree that they are useful for my own comfort and my own psychological welfare are beneficial to me, but this concept of rights is pretty much from an alien universe, very much from the storyverse. And so why give up on this God, as we saw in the Metaphysical Club? Well, we seem to want to go without this God because we find this God emotionally disturbing. For some people, appeal to this God is psychologically and scientifically lazy. And so, well, let's get rid of this God and perhaps we'll be better off without him. Now, this is, of course, something similar to the God of the gaps. And as I mentioned, what I mean by fudge often is not just kind of a lazy trying to slide through an awkward social or intellectual moment. That would be something akin to Jordan Peterson's lying pastors. But what we try to do is we've got this problem over here and it needs a solution, at least for us to live and feel comfortable for ourselves, so we sort of slide God in. And God fixes all of these equations for us. Now, we use God to do the work that we can't do or don't know how we can finish. And that's sort of the God of the gaps and the father of all fudge. Now, C.S. Lewis reminds us in Miracles and a good number of his other books that we imagine that these gaps are all receding. That the more that we learn about science, the more that we know, the fewer jobs we have for this God anymore. And in fact, the progress of science is to work God out of a job. Now, I'm not sure this is exactly the right Neil deGrasse Tyson clip when he was on Colbert, but I distinctly remember Tyson making the point that as we learn more, actually, we learn how much less we know because the world just keeps getting larger. It's not that the world is this finite land, and as we grow in it, we colonize more and more bits of knowledge, and then suddenly we'll have the whole continent because of, as John Vervaeke notes, this combinatorial explosion aspect to reality. The deeper we get into different aspects of reality, the more we see it, the more combinations we have. Almost by definition, the more we know, the more we realize we don't know, and the deeper we get into this experience of combinatorial explosion. Now, one of the things that has crept into these conversations often have been the use of the psychedelic drugs. And if you go all the way back early in my YouTube journey, I had a conversation with Dr. Jim Frazee, who teaches. He teaches psychology. He's got a PhD in neuropsychologist, and we talked about these drugs a bit. And I read Michael Pollan's To Change Your Mind. One of the functions that these biologically that these drugs seem to have is they address the mechanisms in our brain, the biochemical mechanisms in our brain that seem to work these frames. Now, again, if you listen to Jordan Peterson talk to Sam Harris, you see this long conversation where Peterson is trying to tell Harris that biologically, via evolution, these frames have been developed into us as we go. Now, this isn't hard to recognize if you have a dog or a cat or a fish or another small animal that you have as a pet, you begin to recognize that one of the real differences between us and our pets and our household animals is that we are so vastly more capable of managing a near infinite number of frames in order to manage the world. The dog and the cat and the lizard and the fish and the cow and the pig have far fewer frames, especially that we're aware of because we can't really speak to them like Dr. Dolittle. And so part of the way that we manage these animals so effectively is we very quickly can understand their frames, and in a sense we mind read into them and are able to basically colonize them because they have so many fewer frames, and we can imaginatively construct these frames in our mind and think as if I'm a dog and be able to predict what the dog would do, that I can go in and I can colonize the dog fairly easily and I can manage the dog. Now we imagine that, well, the world is sort of like this, and so we'll keep colonizing the frames. But again, as I said, the more frames we learn and the more knowledge we get, this combinatorial explosion, as if we're on psychedelics, we get to these moments where we realize, oh my goodness, without these frames, of which we have so many of them as compared to the animals, we can't manage the world, and that leads to all these fascinating psychedelic experiences. So in other words, unlike the subtraction story, as Charles Taylor calls it, the world is not actually getting smaller. The more we learn, the world is actually getting larger, which leads to the fact that we're probably going to have more gaps that we will use God to fudge with as we go further. And I know this gets into the idea that, well, religion is receding and belief in God is receding. It could very well be that we discover the opposite, that we have to fudge more and more, because the more we learn, the more we realize we don't know, and the more fantastic the world appears, and the better this ancient attempt at dealing with the great unknown becomes. Now, it might be that this moves around a bit, and we continue to penetrate different aspects of humanity, different aspects of ourselves, different aspects of nature in many ways. As we penetrate them, we find more and more utility. But as we're seeing in the meaning crisis, and as we're seeing in the crisis that Brett Weinstein points to, the more we penetrate, the more power we have, the less we actually know and can deal with each other in a productive, hierarchical fashion that unites us rather than divides us and makes us destructive. The more we know, the more we realize we can't account for, and that makes people all the more dangerous. Now, one way that this expresses itself is the question of telos and discernment, because what we usually do is we say, well, and I hear Brett Weinstein do this all the time, well, we can critique the ancient religions because we know they're not moral. And what Brett never does is account for his own morality, or be able to do so in the light of even what Plato and Socrates noted, that it's really, really hard to do. And in fact, the more we know about ourselves in terms of this biological evolutionary track that Brett likes to work on, the more difficult it is to understand, well, what is truly good? What is good apart from good towards a particular end that we want, when we can't, in fact, justify the end? Now, one of the ways that we get into this is arguments for and against purpose. Things are too complex. This is what Christians say. Things are too complex to be accidental. But even this word accidental is difficult. For example, we cannot account for the location of atomic particles. And so we say, well, these are random. And if you go to that YouTube video that I've pointed out a few times, where he tried to arrive at random numbers, because human beings are really terrible at deriving random numbers. We use things like radioactive particles and our ability to measure them and our ability to sort of plot them to come up with these random numbers. But we don't actually know whether or not they are in fact random. They sort of create a bell curve often, or other patterns that we look at. So can there really be anything random? And can there actually be accidents? Or are words like random or accident, when we can't pick out a particular thing or predict it in a time, is that really simply a function of our own limitation and not a function of something out there in the world? Because remember, as I said earlier in this video, we always have to keep an eye on the subject. And we might say that's random, and what we actually mean by that's random is that neither I nor you can adequately predict or account for a phenomenon that we both can measure and agree is out there apart from either one of us. So we can't even be sure such a thing as accident exists, because it presumes to know whether or not there is intention or intentionality. And you're beginning to notice this word coming up again and again. Now, intentionality is all about, well, here's beginning point A, here's desired outcome B, where that desire comes from, another whole complex another understanding, that there's a mind that chose point A in the causality chain in order to achieve point B and could change things to get to that point. That's all intentionality. And remember, going back to the metaphysical club, intentionality is what we're trying to get rid of. Now, a great deal of why I think, when I listen to people talk about, well, why I don't think there is a God, I hear things like this. There's too much suffering or chaos for there to be a good God. Now, this, of course, points us back to a lot of ancient conversations. Ancients, again, remembered, said, well, we can account for this amazing world and these amazing capacities that human beings have to the near exclusion of everything else that we find. We can account for this because of beings or gods or something else that bestowed it upon us to limited degree. If you get to the beginning of C.S. Lewis's book, The Problem of Pain, you begin to realize, well, that then is an issue, because the issue is not necessarily whether or not there are beings or a being that bestowed this upon us, but the moral quality of that being. And this, again, moral quality is something that we have a tremendously difficult time creating a rule for. Now, not nice for me, as many of us know, is insufficient for what we conclude to be morality. So there's too much chaos or too much suffering in the world for a good God. And you might look into the work of Alvin Plantinga to work on his philosophical arguments with respect to the problem of evil, because this is essentially what's beneath the problem of evil. We think we could do better. That's, I think, a difficult argument to make when you look at human history. And we say, surely an omni-God, omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient, could do better, and we imagine that there would be no suffering. But again, as Alvin Plantinga in his treatment of the problem of evil notes, how do we know that? Well, we likely don't, and it's really hard to make an argument, in fact, that we do, and it's really hard to find a baseline, a track record, a human track record that says we, in fact, are a good bet for being better than God. In fact, a lot of the other conversations that we have are, well, why do we allow markets, at least in the West, to determine so much? Well, it's because we believe that in the experience of, let's say, the Soviet Union, centralized planning was dumber than markets. So in other words, we even know ourselves we're not really good at sitting on top of the food chain, and the best we can do is sort of add inputs here or there, like the Federal Reserve or other nation states do, to try and make things a little bit better. Now again, back to the book, The Problem of Pain, where C.S. Lewis in his first chapters really lays out a number of these things. As I've said in previous videos, Lewis, in the beginning of The Problem of Pain, lays out two different senses that we possess. The sense of the numinous, which seems to be unseen agency against which we are powerless. And this is awe and terror. Now, obviously, in online celebrity debates, people will say, well, there's no such agency. That's simply a trick. Well, okay. But scientifically, and many celebrity atheists will agree with this, you cannot scientifically account for whether or not those agents are or aren't there. You simply can't do it, because we don't have, by definition, this realm is not within the tools for scientists to access. What we do have is a pretty dramatic experiential claim on the part of human beings that they have experience of these things. One of the interesting things that I noted in Brett Weinstein's argument about this tribe that escaped the devastation of the tsunami is that if you look at that entire sequence with a scientific perspective, you would have to argue that the spiritual science of the tribe who lost no lives was, in terms of outcomes, superior to the rest of the people that didn't have the imagined religious science of that tribe and who had people die in the tsunami that eventually flooded the beach. Now, Brett wants to say there's no such spirit in the water. This is the point that I made to Adam in my conversation with him when we watched a little bit of Brett's video. How do you know there's no spirit in the water? Science can't tell you whether or not there's a spirit in the water, but this tribe who believed there was a spirit in the water, they had an outcome that, in fact, surpassed the outcome of the people who didn't have that belief. Now, in most tellings of what science does, well, science can predictably achieve outcomes superior to superstition. Well, in that case, the belief of the people would be science, and the other folks were sort of dabbling in superstitions. So we have this capacity for the numinous, C.S. Lewis asserts, where we imagine, we see, we experience, we claim to behold unseen agency against which we are powerless, and we have this additional sense of morality, where despite the fact that we can't establish a rule of justice or a rule of piety, we have an imperfect sense of, well, this seems to work. Now, where this sense arises from, scientifically from below, well, that's obviously the subject of a lot of conversation. We have these terms, good and evil, and we use them in unconditional settings, not just good for my family surviving the tsunami, or good for having $1 million in the bank for retirement, but good itself and evil itself, these poles on the edge of existence. There's a deep connection to a massive heuristic, and John Vervaeke dealt with some of that there. To a massive heuristic about ultimate ends in themselves. And that's what morality claims, and at the sense that we do. And it's also sort of connected to outcomes, but never completely. We love moral heroes, let's say, who under the totalitarian Nazi regime resisted the Nazis and paid for their resistance with their death. We look upon them as moral heroes, even though their death was, if you're looking at individual survival, a bad outcome. And of course, the story of Jesus as an archetypal story, and in my opinion, as a historical story, exemplifies this, that morality is always in tension with outcomes. And again, this is where our attempt to give a rule for justice or a rule for piety really falls short. So now where's the source of this communal knowledge? Now, Brett Weinstein sort of jumps in here and says, well, with a very facile condemnation of the wisdom in ancient books, that while we all surely know that these ancient moralities are bankrupt, and you would have to ask, how do we? One of the things that I encounter very often is the sociology of knowledge argument being thrown at Christians. Well, you believe that God, and we rightly imagine as top of some sort of monarchical hierarchy, that God should in fact think something of the fact that you were born into a Christian family and born into a country where Christianity is fairly prevalent, that you would be a Christian, whereas someone who is Muslim would be born into that Muslim country and they would be a Muslim. Now, the same thing holds for all of Brett's morality claims. And someone could easily say to Brett, well, your self-evident morality is simply a function of the time and place and experiences that you were born. You can make no greater claim as to morality beyond that. Just like with the same argument from sociology of knowledge, someone might be a Christian because they're born into a Christian family. Someone might be a Muslim because they're born into an Islamic nation. This is the question. And the problem, of course, is, well, what about those who deviate? What about those who employ this rationality and begin to manipulate outcomes via it? And then we have the problem of rationality that, again, C.S. Lewis posits in his book, in his book Miracles. You'd have to know what morality is apart from your experience. In fact, I think this is the seed of the idea of divine revelation. Now, you might debate whether or not you agree with divine revelation, but this is, in a sense, the conceptual seed behind the idea that somehow, perhaps it's via this moral sense, perhaps it's via, as Lewis says, the combination of the moral and the numinous, that somehow we have a sense of what is truly right and truly good. And you will hear Brett Weinstein and pretty much everyone else make those claims. And again, as C.S. Lewis points out in his book Miracles, almost everyone who believes in the whole show stops to make these claims and leverages these claims and uses these claims as arguments for their claims, but have a great deal of difficulty founding their claims. What in a sense we are doing is we are crowdsourcing our monarchical vision, which is what we always do with it. So we have to ask, what is the source of this communal knowledge? Now, I spent the last couple of weeks going to a lot of church meetings where in the Dutch Reformed tradition, we have organizations called a classis. And what a classis are is a regional group of churches. And one of the things that we have to do in these meetings are do examinations for ministerial candidates. And so I had an opportunity as a synodical deputy, which is a role that I have to play sometimes in my denomination. I had an opportunity to sit in on some Korean classes as they do their examinations. And in my own classis, where I'm not a synodical deputy, but just a delegate, I had to sit in on those examinations there. Well, what are we doing when we're doing this? Well, actually, we're doing something that Brett Weinstein doesn't seem to have a lot of knowledge of, but should be able to understand quite readily. There's all this knowledge and agreement of compliance within a tradition with, and this always trips up a lot of people, the Word of God. Well, what do we mean by that phrase, the Word of God? Well, we essentially mean that what we have here is this body of knowledge that has come down to us through time, that the church has lived with and worked with. And I love Brett Weinstein's image of the Bible sort of, and I've used this actually for quite a few years now, the Bible sort of as the genetic code of the church, and the confessional communities, the theologies, the theologians, and Christians as sort of the epigenetics that turn the code on and off, because what we see is that your Christian next door is not living the same way as King David in the late Bronze, early Iron Age, but in fact is not holding slaves, does not have multiple wives, in fact is living to a great degree like the secular neighbor who has no conscious Christian affiliation or tradition, because they've all been sort of making their way through time. But what is going on in the Christian world is that the Christians' involvement in a religious institution is actually putting them into conversation with their ancient predecessors from all around the globe, a tremendously cultural, diverse conversation that is working through the application of all of these things down to all of the particulars of our life. That's, in fact, how a religion operates. And, in fact, the real crisis that many of us have is not the crisis we imagine ourselves to have. The real crisis that we have is we live in this tiny bubble, which is very relevant to our particular context. But if we hope to have a larger degree of wisdom that is connected to a far larger community of people who have survived, whose ideas have survived in a fairly Darwinian context, well, what should we do? Well, we should be reading ancient history. We should be reading and applying the wisdom of the ancients. And in fact, religions all across the board do this and do this well. It doesn't mean they're all in agreement. And in fact, I would argue that their disagreement is a feature and in many ways not a bug. because, well, how could anyone in a scalable way have the ability to actually engage this tremendous amount of wisdom over a tremendous number of centuries, all built in not only into propositional truths, that's one aspect, but procedural truths and perspectival truths and participatory knowledge. All of this together, well, religions do that, and religions do that in a fairly reliable way. Now, do they do it perfectly? Well, no. But we wouldn't even know perfection if it appeared to us because, again, because of the frame problem, we would have to have a frame by which we could bring it in, process it, figure out what to do with it, and apply it to our lives. And in this sense, God is the frame of all frames, because in a very scalable way, all the way from small children, individuals with Down syndrome, people who have $1 million or a PhD, all along the way you will find people operating in religion, working out this stuff, getting outside of their little relevance bubble, because of course, that which is relevance is not just that which is present in the now, but that which has been for a very, very long time. Because, well, part of the difficulty, I wish I could zoom back out to the big picture because I'm doing all this talk in the little picture here. In many ways, what secularity and living in the now is like driving a car through the fog. You can't see very far in front of you, you can't see very far behind you, and you have to sort of reckon in the fog in this way. That's, in a sense, what living without religion is like. Now, what living religion is like is actually having some idea of what may be ahead of you based on many, many generations, and often the best and the brightest of those generations feeding into you about what has been in the past. And that's part of the reason why religions are inherently conservative-ish. They act like sort of a weight on your impulses. And in fact, if you've been formed by a religion, that's what they do. Now, I have a lot of respect and actually a lot of eagerness to talk to people who are not religious for this reason, because I'm all about taking in many signals. And those who look to critique religions, well, I'll tell you, within a religious tradition, this is what we do all the time. Part of what happens in these candidacy examinations are that people, the examiner, or usually anybody who is a delegate, can ask a question of the candidate. They will ask them questions usually about the issues of our time that the religious community is dealing with. And so in many conservative Christian denominations, Christians are dealing with questions of same-sex marriage and the like. Well, some people would say, well, why are you still dealing with that? Well, hasn't the law changed? Well, sure, the law has changed. And you can find churches out there that all is all, and they're flying rainbow flags and so on and so forth. But religions keep around their dead ancestors and their perspectives and give them a seat at the table and are a little less quick to jump on board certain things. I also made this point to Adam in my conversation with him with respect to Brett Weinstein. If you look at the Scopes trial, which is often trotted out as, oh, finally the defeat of religion, William Jennings Bryan, who was a populist, was also basically really trying to resist the eugenics, social Darwinism that very much was held as the scientific theory of the day. And he did so from a religious perspective. And he did so on behalf of a moral argument, saying that, well, just looking at a bunch of these external characteristics probably shouldn't lead you to make quick determinations about certain races being more developed than other races and then constructing certain political outcomes on the basis of that. This, again, read late 19th, early 20th century, all up until really World War II, these ideas were prevalent. Today we look at them and say, well, they're just racist. But this racism was said to have scientific validity. And it was the religious people that walked in and said, we're not so sure about your science, and so we're going to take some time. And I would argue that part of the reason that religions seem to have been a very successful means by which human societies have flourished is because if you've got a situation of rapid change, you're probably going to want a fair amount of the population being a drag on that change, being a little bit skeptical, and questioning it with respect to, well, what do our ancestors have to say? What wisdom do we have from them? That's actually, when you think it through, a fairly important adaptive advantage, and probably part of the reason that religions in general have been so successful among human populations. Now, back to God and the world is too big for you. Via consciousness, we need to filter our interactions with the world through something. And this very much gets into my conversation with John. You see, most of the time we filter the world through a need, through a desire. If you take water away from me for hours, and in fact, not a whole lot of hours, put me in a hot situation, water will it'll run right to the top of my salience landscape. Water will come right to the top of my hierarchy. A need or desire begins to frame the world, and we use consciousness for this. I'm a fan of watching Alone and some of these other reality TV shows where people go out into the wilderness all by themselves, and then they just talk to the camera and they share, well, what's going on in their mind, how much they think about food. Well, yeah, of course. Well, why is that in their consciousness? How does that bleed into their consciousness? Well, these needs or desires become frames. But to a degree, once we're satisfied, you can watch the sermon I preached last week, because it's a close race between physical needs and meaning needs, as you can see in instances of suicide. But something existential in a moment or a context then can very quickly become the frame. It might be my status in the community. Now, if you might recognize, we're knocking on the Jordan Peterson segment of this conversation. We need to act. We want to act. Someone has attacked my reputation. I'm going to act. Maybe I'm going to attack their reputation in retaliation. Maybe I'm going to do something defensive in order to promote my reputation. Maybe I'm going to do an act of benevolence in order to make myself look better. All of this is happening in this world too big for us. Now, again, in religious traditions, God, who is a person, who is all present, who makes stipulations on my life, this is a very big adaptive feature of human beings for almost all of history in terms of how to act in this world. And if you think about it, you might say, well, if you take it from sort of a secular perspective and say, well, I'd really like to involve the wisdom of the ancients in my attempts to guide my actions in this world. And, well, how might I do that? Well, I could go to university and I could start taking philosophy courses and history courses and English courses. In fact, many of the courses within the humanities and psychology courses. And I could do all of that in order to involve the wisdoms of the ancient into my life. But right away, if you've been paying any attention to the Vervaeke course, you'll know that, okay, you're gaining all this propositional knowledge, but that's only 1/4 of his 4 P's of knowing. There's procedural knowledge and perspectival knowledge and participatory knowledge. How are you going to gain those things? You don't get a lot of those things from the university. In fact, many of the things you're going to get from the university are from your bubble. Well, where would I get that? Religion. Well, what do you mean? Well, you're living underneath the view of this God. Well, that's very perspectival and participatory. You're practicing the rituals of your religious tradition. And you're living within the moral guidelines of that religious tradition. That's very participatory. You've been taught, you've been indoctrinated into the propositional ways of knowing from your religion. In fact, what you find is that religions are scalable, highly reliable delivery systems in order to take the wisdom of thousands of years of human civilization and to deploy it to people on massive scales. And the breakdown of those religious systems, which is what we're seeing in the West, is likely having, well, it's creating and contributing to the meaning crisis. That's in fact the basis of this entire conversation. Now, all the way back to Jordan Peterson, because some of you have been like, well, you talk about Vervaeke and you don't talk about Peterson. I started watching your channel because of Peterson. Peterson has been talking about this frame problem right from the beginning. John Vervaeke has been laying it out in a very academic, cognitive science way. Peterson approached it much more, as you've heard in a number of my conversations, as a preacher, as a religion. I think that's part of the reason Peterson has been heard how he has heard. And the question is, well, how do we learn where? So if you go back again to Hubert Dreyfus, where does this knowledge reside? It's really hard to know why. Well, if we sort of shift frames here from academic philosophy over into religion and some kind of religious psychology, things like Jung, well, you can see where a lot of these things are residing and how, in fact, they are being delivered via stories. Now, again, I said early on, when John Vervaeke wants to illustrate the frame problem, notice how quickly narrative comes into the mix. That's, in a sense, our machine code here in terms of dealing with, you look at the 4 Ps, narrative takes these 4 Ps and wraps them all together nicely. Religions are narratives within which we live. Now, let's look at a little bit of Peterson from 2015 and his lecture on Carl Jung.
And I would say, you know how you hear evolutionary psychologists talk sometimes about the fact that we evolved on the African veldt and now our nervous systems are sort of adapted for that primordial environment and not really for the modern environment, and so there's a mismatch between us and the modern world. It's like
That's Brett Weinstein's bread and butter.
I think that's an absolutely reprehensible theory, partly because
Not that Jordan's gonna soft sell it all. It's a reprehensible theory.
we didn't just evolve on the veldt. We've been evolving for a very long time. We spent a lot more time in trees, for example, than we did on the veldt. And while we were spending time in trees, a lot of us were eaten by snakes, for example. And so that's another reason why the unknown itself is represented as this terrible, predatory, reptilian beast.
Why did the biblical series have so much impact? Because Jordan, in many ways, is connecting the dots. He's saying, well, look at what religion has done for us. Look at how reliably, in such a deployable way where even small children learn the lessons, look at how religion has been deploying this and dealing with the frame problems, many frame problems, for us in such a reliable, predictable, scalable way for so very long.
And then the human being is represented as that which, or the conscious element of the human being, which was represented by the Mesopotamians as a god, the highest god actually in the hierarchy of gods, which was a brilliant Mesopotamian realization, because the Mesopotamians basically concluded in their drama, their religious drama, that the highest faculty of the human being was the capacity to consciously attend to the unknown and to make something new out of it.
The frame. That's what we're doing with these frames.
That the highest faculty of the human being was the capacity to consciously attend to the unknown and to make something new out of it.
And what we employ in that is the God.
Well, that's a Piagetian idea, right? That's exactly what Piaget was talking about when he talked about the necessity of comprehending knowledge as a process rather than as a collection of facts. It's a process. What's the process? Confront what you don't understand. Boldly go where no one has ever gone.
And this, you can find your way over to Vervaeke's 4 Ps through there. Procedural knowledge, perspectival knowledge, participatory knowledge.
Right? I mean, Star Trek, that's where systematizing minds get their mythology. You know, it's rife with mythology, and its initial statement is a mythological statement, and it's a statement of the eternal explorer. And that's an archetypal idea. And, you know, you might say, well, are you still threatened by those terrible things that threatened your ancestors on the veldt? And normally people would say, well, no, because there are no lions. But that's because they don't get the categories right. Lion is a sub...
Did you say categories? Well, what do we have to do to manage these categories? Well, we certainly manage them instinctively often, but these categories are not anywhere near so simple as we imagined they were.
But ancestors on the veldt, and normally people would say, well, no, because there are no lions. But that's because they don't get the categories right. Lion is a subcategory of unknown horrible thing. And you guys are surrounded by unknown horrible things just like people have always been surrounded by.
Now there's lions over in the Sacramento Zoo, and I have absolutely no fear of them. In fact, people go to look at them. In awe and wonder they look at the lion. Well, why? Well, we've recategorized the lion, haven't we? And we've managed to do that without even thinking about categories at all, or having any knowledge of frames at all.
Unknown horrible things. So, because you're just as prone to disease, not quite as prone, but fundamentally you're a finite being. And there's things everywhere that act in a predatory manner in relationship to you, and you will die. And so the idea that the material conditions of our environment have changed in a qualitative manner since the time we spent on the veldt it's an error of category. The mythological categories are categories that represent environmental entities, so to speak, some of which are social, that have existed for vast stretches of time and which exceed our capacity to detect with our senses.
Frames.
So one representation, for example, is the Great Father, or the Wise Old Man. And the Wise Old Man, or the Great Father, is fundamentally a representation of the dominance hierarchy. Now, the problem with the dominance hierarchy is you can't see it. But it's there. It's really there. And then figures like the Great Mother, especially the tarot, because most of the archetypal figures come in pairs, a positive element and a negative element. And that's because virtually everything that manifests itself to you in a complex environment, if you're a living being, takes with one hand and gives with the other. You know, so nature is benevolent and kind and wise and the source of all new knowledge, and also cancer and malarial mosquitoes and the tsetse fly and the guinea worm and all these things that are horrifying and destructive beyond belief, and you're stuck.
And he's just mapped that all in the word nature. Now, if I were to use the word natural, an industrialized urban thing, you'd be thinking about, well, things like gravity, where, you know, my cell phone stand just falls. Notice, again, how even these categories, in terms of their frames, how they move around. And again, we are so adept at this, we do this without even thinking about it.
With both, and then society, we talked about this before, that's the Great Father. It's on the one hand, here you are, benevolently protected by your social surround. On the other hand, social structures tend towards tyranny and authoritarianism, and they oppress the individuals within them at the same time that they sustain their development. And so that's a dichotomous archetype. And then there's the individual who's, on the one hand, a remarkable and wonderful creature, and on the other hand, someone who's capable of atrocities like those that characterized the actions of many millions of people in the 20th century. Those are all archetypes. There are more archetypes than that. Like the archetype of the predatory reptile with something to offer, which is essentially a dragon, is the most fundamental archetypal representation. Jung found that representation in alchemical manuscripts, mostly in the form of the Ouroboros, which is a snake that eats its own tail. And it's a symbol of matter and spirit in union, because the snake is sort of matter, and the wings on the snake, the dragon, make it spirit. So it's like the fundamental elements of reality are matter and spirit in some kind of conjoined state. And the fundamental task of the human being is to come to terms with the nature of that unknown thing. Now, think about it this way. Well, why would ancient people represent the unknown as such, as a reptilian, self-contained reptilian form that was both spiritual and material? Well, here's the reason. First, the unknown's dangerous, and you could be its prey. So you better have that representation at hand. And then you might ask, well, is that really the unknown? And then I would say, well, it depends absolutely on what you mean by really. From a Darwinian perspective, that was the best way to conceptualize the unknown. And then you might say, well, that doesn't make it real. And then I might say, are you sure about that? Is there anything more real than representations derived from Darwinian processes? The Darwinists would say no. Okay, so why is it matter and spirit? Or why is it winged and on the ground at the same time? Well, you can also understand this from a Piagetian perspective. And so that is because when you encounter the unknown, you separate the material world and the spiritual world. And the spiritual world is the psychological world. And so what you're doing when you encounter the unknown is you parse some of it up into the world, and you incorporate other elements of it into yourself.
Now, this gets really complicated really fast, but this split then, so again, you have that, what you're conceptualizing, what you're doing again is this framing. And so let's get back to the birthday party. Well, you're framing, you've got the birthday party framed over here, you've got the old and new framed over there, you've got all of these frames going on, and in fact this split that we do is exactly what we have to do in order to survive, in order to engage the world properly. And what comes out of it is, in fact, a very rich, symbolic, historical history. Now, again, I'm speaking from below, and people will often hear this and say, yeah, but you're not making an ontological argument from above. And no, I'm not. But what I'm trying to point out is that if you want to have an understanding of why we came up with this idea of God, okay, I'm talking from below. I'm a Christian minister who believes that in fact this all comes from God. If you remember my ancient split, this sort of emerged from down below. That's the post-Darwinian argument. I think we're actually better off saying it was given to us from above. There's plenty of problems going from either direction, and theology in fact deals with a lot of them that come from above. A lot of the scientists are struggling with the problems that come from the area from down below, and in a sense we're sort of meeting in the middle here and having our conversations. But this split, which, we can look at the axial age and wonder, well, why on earth, after the late Bronze Age collapse, did they split it? Well, probably because they figured out, well, this is a tremendously adaptive tool that really helps us reframe the world in so many different ways, that gives us tremendous power. And I would argue that part of what happens in the Protestant Reformation is another reframing that afforded all kinds of advantages to us. And of course, the advantages also came with problems.
And the best way to think about that, I think, from a conceptual perspective, so it becomes more understandable, is that what you encounter when you encounter the unknown is patterned information. And you take some of that patterned information into yourself, even by doing something as simple as gripping something you want to pick up, because you're imitating the pattern of the thing that you want to pick up. And that's how you're transforming its structure into an element of your being. And so when you're exploring the unknown, it's a constructivist idea, you're simultaneously constructing the world and constructing yourself. And thus, the inference is the unknown is made out of that which can be parsed out into psyche and matter. And it's dangerous. So it's a perfectly reasonable representation. And that's why it won't go away. So Jung's fundamental contribution, I would say, is his analysis of hero mythology. And I would say that's the fundamental element of his thinking. Now, the relationship between that and Nietzsche is fundamentally this. Nietzsche believed that once the religious systems collapsed, we would have to consciously produce our new set of values. But Jung believed that the psyche was the source of all value. And so that it wasn't a matter of creating new values, it was a matter of discovering the values that were already lying dormant and implicit within us. So, and then...
Now, here's a little trick in our culture. When he says within us, is he talking within me and you, or within all of us as a group? Because one of the things that you very quickly, well, at least that I very quickly saw with this relevance realization, is that there's a real scalability to this. In some ways, I thought about this morning, to what degree does the thermostat on the wall over here in the church, it's not on this wall, it's actually way over in the sanctuary, does relevance realization work in that thermostat? Like when it gets to a certain degree, a certain temperature, and the air conditioning turns on or the heat turns on, is it relevance realization that is working in that thermostat? And because that thermostat is nested within a whole series of other things, within an industrial revolution that has HVAC systems, and within a whole human context that prefers one temperature or another. And in fact, again, the combinatorial explosion, even just looking through the frame of the thermostat on the church wall, explodes very quickly. And so where Peterson comes around, so we're spending a lot of time in Vervaeke, and Vervaeke's been so generous in terms of laying out all kinds of things in helpful ways. And I so wish that, it's a selfish wish, because I'm sure Jordan likes the money and the fame and all of these things that he's derived from his status rocket ride. But Peterson is filling out a different element of this conversation than Vervaeke is. Okay, and it's in that sense that we can begin, and they have differences, of course, but we can begin to understand how they both fit into this conversation and this world. Because Peterson is filling out, in many ways, a lot of the frames that we are using and that are not going away. Vervaeke helps us see, well, what on earth is a frame? Well, Peterson is wading in sort of as a preacher, using mythological language to say these frames are still operable among us. And the simplistic discarding of them via, let's say, the celebrity atheists, it really has no validity. Jordan Peterson tells a story that is adapted to our cultural context in the kinds of exploratory stories like Adam, for example. There are gods in the story, and the fundamental mechanisms that we feel we partly know and are comfortable living with. In other words, well, where does this stuff fit in, and basically, the celebrity atheists have been saying, well, these religious texts are just made up stories that don't tell us anything about the world. And what Peterson did with his biblical story is say, no, there's this strange concordism, which is a point that I made in my conversation with Craig Stewart about René Girard. I've been doing a lot of work on René Girard, and René Girard will likely begin to get incorporated into this big mix of things that I do in these strange monologue videos. But all of this comes together between us. Let's see. Is there another slide? So what are we doing? Oh, we're doing what we're always doing. We're figuring out our necessary elements of fudge to make the equations balance. We're adjusting them in our motivated anxiety comfort controllers to try and stay as comfortable as possible while also as interested and interesting as possible. We're trying to figure out not only how to live, but how to live well, and how to have all of us doing this together. So again, what I said to John, and what I don't think I've done terribly effectively in this video, but I think I'm going to post it anyway, is in fact that this frame problem is something we're going to want to continue to learn about and figure out, because as I mentioned to John, I think this is the last slide. Yeah. As I mentioned to John, when I read Christian theology and read the Bible and look at the cognitive science and the conversations that we're having in this, as John says, our little corner of the internet, things are coming together. Okay, things are coming together for me in ways, and I'm beginning to understand where some of this cognitive science maps onto some of the stuff that we find in the Bible, some of the moves that Christian theology has made. And this is, in fact, the work that preachers need to do when we preach, so that our sermons are relevant to people and seen as relevant, and not just what churches tend to do is create this rather siloed narrative structure, which is really very functional. If it wasn't functional, people wouldn't stay in it. It's not perfectly functional. People do escape it because, this isn't working for me, and they either adopt another one, and I think actually secularism is another one, and all the various sub-silos within them. But what Christians tend to do is you have these historical sub-silos and silos within which, people can live fairly well. And so they stay in it, and it affords them meaning, and it affords them wisdom, and it affords them all of these things that many, in fact, are noticing. As our societies become less religious, we no longer have access to. And so as we continue to learn what we do in terms of cognitive science, in terms of all kinds of other sciences, religious communities are always late to the game, again, partly because of the sort of conservative drag that religions by design put on quickly adapting new lifestyles and things. Okay? And again, different religions work on different speeds, and there's almost infinite variability to the respect that different religions do that, and different traditions and all of their theologies and all of their practices. It's a highly complex situation, but again, it makes a lot of sense when you understand the challenge of the frame problem, the changing of context and environment that is both social, cultural, and physical. We're doing important work here in trying to figure this stuff out and in sharing it with each other, because these problems are real and these challenges are real, and they're almost all far more complex than we assumed they would be.